Hello, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story that, like many stories today, comes with an idea from social media. For me, my social media vices are Instagram and the New York Times cooking community on Facebook. After scrolling through my social media platforms, I decided it would be a good idea to make sourdough bread. Ugh, I know. Once I convinced myself I even had the skills to make sourdough bread, I did some research on sourdough bread recipes and decided to use a pictorial step-by-step guide on sourdough bread from my favorite cooking website, the New York Times Cooking. And it was a mistake. It was an absolute mistake. So many things went wrong, and the result was this. Yes, that. It was oddly shaped, relatively flat, extremely tough, and the butt of my family jokes for weeks to come. When I stepped back and I evaluated my process, I tried to find mistakes that I could have made that threw off my bread so much. As a scientist, my goal would be to find one thing that went wrong and change it. That is, one thing at a time. Let's just say I found a lot of problems this first time around, but I'll tell you one thing that I changed, and that was to use a new recipe. I messaged my baking friend, Andy. He recommended a blog designed specifically for sourdough newbies. I know. I used that new recipe and I followed it to a T. It was a lot simpler than the New York Times recipe and, best of all, it worked. But even after I was happy with the taste and texture of my bread, turns out my husband wasn't. And he informed me that the shape of my bread made for an awkward sandwich. And so I went out to the internet and I researched how I could make my bread more, bread-shaped. And I came up with the idea of baking my bread in pans instead of on a cookie sheet. I repeated the process, except at the end, I baked it in a baking pan. And it worked. And I've been using this process ever since. In fact, I was so proud that I shared my success on, wait for it, social media. Was this process scientific? At first glance, maybe not. But when we dig deep, any problem that we face in real life can be approached with the scientific method. Let's walk back through the great sourdough adventure of spring 2020 to see a living demonstration of the scientific method. Step 1, ask a question. In this case, the question would be, how can I make the best sourdough bread? Step 2, research. I went out on the research, scoured for the perfect sourdough recipe. Step 3, construct a hypothesis. Based on my research and my prior experience with different cooking websites, I decided that the New York Times was my safest bet. And my hypothesis was that the New York Times would make the best sourdough. Step 4, test my hypothesis. This is where the actual baking came in. And finally, or not finally, second to last step, 5, analyze the data. In this case, the data were my bread. Now, this part of the scientific method is where things get a little choose your own adventure-y. If you're happy with your results, you can move on to the final step, step 6, communicate your results. I actually did communicate my results in the way of a self-deprecating Instagram post about how my bread attempt failed. But when I analyzed my bread data, I realized that even though my bread was edible, it's not a recipe that I cared to repeat. So I went back to step 2, research, and I asked Andy to help me find a new recipe. I redeveloped my hypothesis that the baking blog, Baking with Jack, offered the best sourdough recipe, and I tested it again. When I analyzed my bread data, I realized that this way was almost better. So I went back and tweaked my hypothesis one more time that Baking with Jack sourdough baked in a pan offered the best sourdough for sandwiches. And finally, I was right, and social media rejoiced. every day, scientists take the same process and they apply it to esoteric or not so esoteric research questions. But we use this process in our everyday lives, whether we know it or not. One big difference is while in our case, sharing our results might mean taking a picture of our bread and posting it on social media, enjoying the bread ourselves, or sharing it with friends or students. In the scientific world, sharing our results means publishing them in a scientific journal where other scientists can repeat, verify, and even build off of your results. We'll practice applying the scientific method in class on the first day.